Henry George, celebrated for his masterwork Progress in Poverty, had reluctantly accepted the call from labor organizations in New York City to be their candidate for mayor in 1886. After a rigorous campaign, George was officially bested by the Democratic Party candidate Abram Hewitt. 4 days later, George spoke to his supporters in the large hall of Cooper Union. He said, "It is not the end of the campaign, it is the beginning. We have fought the first skirmish." Well, Henry George and his close supporters had declared war on the status quo, a war that would have many skirmishes and a few major battles as the decades came and went, continuing to this very moment in time. Immediately following the mayoral election, John McMakin, Reverend Dr. Edward McGlynn, and James Redpath met to develop a plan for what Henry George Jr. later described as, quote, systematic educational work through the medium of lectures and speeches and reading matter. Redpath, as managing editor of the North American Review, was an ally able to keep the message of Henry George in the public mind. Edward McGlynn was in the process of shaking up the orthodoxy of Catholicism. John McMakin was chairman of the executive committee of the Labor Party. A committee opened an office in the Cooper Union building and commenced organization efforts by promoting land and labor clubs. Henry George soon announced the start of a new weekly newspaper, The Standard, the first number issued in January of 1887. Some 75,000 copies of the first number were printed. The next step in the plan was to form a militant organization to fight for the elimination of poverty, which became the Anti-Poverty Society. Dr. McGlynn was named president and Henry George vice president. At this time, Henry George hoped that his proposals for reform would be endorsed by the United Labor Party at its August meeting in Syracuse, New York. However, socialists fought to use the party to press for the abolition of all private property used for the production of wealth. In the Standard, George stated his position so there would be no confusion. He wrote, "Either they must go out or the majority must go out, for it is certain that the majority of the men who constitute the United Labor Party do not propose to nationalize capital and are not in favor of the abolition of all private property in the instruments of production." Despite a massive public education effort, Henry George's next attempt to attain elected office, that of Secretary of State of New York, on the United Labor Party ticket, failed miserably. This cartoon, titled "The Poverty Problem Solved," appeared in the May 1887 issue of Puck, lampooning George and McGlynn. George expanded on his views regarding the taxation of income in an article appearing in The World, the issue dated 19 November 1887. He would support an income tax to replace what he described as, quote, onerous duties upon the bringing into the country of things the people want. An income tax was direct and therefore fairer than indirect taxes, as he explained. Unlike those taxes, an income tax does not check and hamper production, and it does not fall upon the poorest class with far more weight than upon the richest class. It does not aim to tax a man upon what he consumes, but which is more rational, upon what he receives. He went on to urge the world in its editorials to champion the income tax as a substitute for indirect taxes, as a way to raise public consciousness. George went on to explain why he could not advocate it. George was calling for an end to monopoly privilege and an end to the redistribution of wealth from producers to non-producers. Part of George's thinking was strategic, as he was convinced there would be stronger support to replace the direct taxation of income with the direct taxation of economic rent of land than had been the case to replace tariffs with the taxation of land values. The key was to get the constitutional authority to make this a public issue. The country now readied for the presidential election of 1888. The Democrats renominating Grover Cleveland, running against the Republican Benjamin Harrison. the Standard entered the debates on the issue of the tariffs, calling for absolute free trade. Henry George Jr. records how the Democratic Party leadership responded. In these and other ways, the Single Taxers carried on such a vigorous radical canvass in support of Cleveland as to make the moderate Democrats murmur, "Deliver us from our friends," and to cause the Democratic managers in New York to give out as a marching refrain in the party parade the lines, don't be afraid. Tariff reform is not free trade." George had no illusions about the overall state of the U.S. economy and the challenge of dealing with an increasing public debt. He wrote in the 11 February 1888 number of the Standard, "The civilized world, and our own country not last in the race, is rushing forward into a sea of indebtedness that must finally submerge in general bankruptcy and repudiation." He agreed with the proposal for, quote, "the abolition of all laws for the collection of private debts." He offered his reasoning. The abolition of all laws for the collection of private debts would not only free our judicial machinery from a clogging mass of business which, to a large degree, prevents its performance of proper functions, but it would unquestionably lead to a far higher standard of personal and commercial morality, since character would then be the prime element in credit. He goes on, "If it lessened, as it undoubtedly would, the use of credit in commercial transactions, the result would be to put business upon a far more sound and stable foundation, and to lessen the intensity of those commercial fluctuations in which periods of stagnation follow periods of speculation." Then, on the 28th of April, George issued a statement in opposition to a national banking system and support of government-issued money, including the greenbacks. He then offered his view on the role of banks. "The proper business of banking is the receiving, the keeping, and the loaning out of money, and the facilitation of exchanges by the extension, interchange, and cancellation of private credits. With the issuance of money, the proper business of banking has nothing whatever to do." Beginning in the 22nd of September 1888 number, the following general mission statement appeared in the Standard, continuing through 14 December 1889. "The Standard advocates the abolition of all taxes upon industry and the products of industry, and the taking by taxation upon land values, irrespective of improvements, of the annual rental value of all those various forms of natural opportunities embraced under the general term land. We hold that to tax labor or its products is to discourage industry." Thus, despite his and the paper's support of Grover Cleveland for president, George wanted to make clear that he in no way had compromised on principle or the ultimate objective of his program for systemic change. In November 1888, Henry George took one of the first steps toward the founding of a national organization committed to the public capture of economic rents. He announced this initiative in his newspaper, The Standard. "We hold that to tax land values to their full amount will render it impossible for any man to exact from others a price for the privilege of using these bounties of nature in which all living men have an equal right of use. That it will compel every individual controlling natural opportunities to either utilize them by the employment of labor or abandon them to others. That it will thus provide opportunities of work for all men and secure to each the full reward of his labor, and that as a result, involuntary poverty will be abolished, and the greed, intemperance, and vice that spring from poverty and the dread of poverty will be swept away." Then, in the November 17, 1888 number of the Standard, George made an important announcement. "A committee has already been appointed and will report in a few days, preparing a form for a national petition to Congress asking for an amendment to the Constitution doing away with the restriction on direct taxes, so as to prepare the way for raising our national revenues by direct instead of indirect taxation, and when we get that far, putting it where it ought to be, on the value of land. George wrote more extensively on the money question in the 14 December 1889 number of the Standard. The greenbackers, who have insisted that national banknotes should not be permitted and that all money should be the direct issue of the government, are in the right. It is a pity that so many greenbackers permit themselves to be used by the silvermen instead of insisting on their own principles. If we want 2 millions of notes issued every month, let them be greenbacks, and let the 2 millions now expended in buying silver be saved. Nothing can be clearer than that the silver notes now in circulation do not derive their value from the silver which is supposed to be corded up in the treasury to redeem them, for they circulate at 100 cents on the dollar, whereas the silver that is supposed to be lying in the treasury vaults for their redemption is only 72 cents worth. They would circulate just as well as if there were no silver in the treasury, and we might as well sell that silver off or put it to some more sensible use than hoarding it. And what is true of silver is true of gold. It is the credit of the government that furnishes the real basis for our paper money, and not any deposit in government vaults. A week later, George added this: "Nor have I any hostility to the silver dollar. What I object to is that the people of the United States should be taxed to buy silver and coin dollars for which they have no use, and that the nation, the far greater part of whose component individuals needs more capital, should keep great hoards of coin bullion lying in treasury vaults, where it is utterly useless to anybody." The national work to promote enabling legislation for the single tax had been led since 1888 by William T. Crosdale, an experienced newspaperman who had come aboard the Standard as managing editor. Supporters were encouraged to petition Congress for a congressional investigation of the single tax policy. A total of 115,500 individual petitions were eventually organized and delivered by Tom L. Johnson to the Speaker of the House for referral to the Ways and Means Committee. Lewis F. Post later summarized the impact. Coffined in that elegant cabinet, the petitions were buried in the silences of the Ways and Means Committee. Nothing of a legislative flavor ever came from them. They had, however, done useful service in propaganda and in bringing into being the Single Tax League of the United States, which had sponsored their later circulation and their ultimate, though futile, presentation to Congress. George and his supporters advanced an enhanced system of revenue sharing based on each level of government replacing all taxation with the taxation of land values. Gains on the sale of land would be fully taxed, as would any income paid by a land tenant to a land owner. Rents paid to lease vacant land would be straightforward. More difficult in execution was to distinguish revenue earned from buildings under lease from revenue unearned from the land on which the building sat. The first nationwide single tax organization was formed in 1890 at a national convention of single taxers held at New York's Cooper Union. Henry George had arrived home from a speaking tour around the globe just in time to take part in the first national single tax conference. At this convention, Lewis F. Post was selected as chairman of the Single Tax League of the United States. The convention attendees determined that the Single Tax League of the United States would be a representative body with one member from each state and territory. The stated purposes of the league were, quote, to incorporate its economic views in law through political action and to lobby the single tax on ethical grounds. On the final day, September 3rd, the convention adopted the following platform. Paragraph 1. We assert as our fundamental principle the self-evident truth enunciated in the Declaration of American Independence that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Paragraph 2. We hold that all men are equally entitled to the use and enjoyment of what God has created and of what is gained by the general growth and improvement of the community of which they are a part. Therefore, no one should be permitted to hold natural opportunities without a fair return to all for any special privilege thus accorded to him, and that value which the growth and improvement of the community attach to land should be taken for use of the community. Paragraph 3. We hold that each man is entitled to all that his labor produces. Therefore, no tax should be levied on the products of labor. Paragraph 4. To carry out these principles, we are in favor of raising all public revenues for national, state, county, and municipal purposes by a single tax upon land values, irrespective of improvements, and of the abolition of all forms of direct and indirect taxation. Paragraph 5. Since in all our states we now levy some tax on the value of land, the single tax can be instituted by the simple and easy way of abolishing, one after another, all other taxes now levied, and commensurately increasing the tax on land values until we draw upon that one source for all expenses of government, the revenue being divided between local governments, state governments, and the general government, as the revenue from direct taxes is now divided between the local and state governments, or a direct assessment being made by the general government upon the states and paid by them from revenues collected in this manner. Paragraph 6. The single tax we propose is not a tax on land, and therefore would not fall on the use of land and become a tax on labor. Paragraph 7. It is a tax not on land but on the value of land. Thus, it would not fall on all land but only on valuable land, and on that not in proportion to the use made of it but in proportion to its value, the premium which the user of land must pay to the owner, either in purchase money or rent, for permission to use valuable land. It would thus be a tax not on the use or improvement of land but on the ownership of land, taking what would otherwise go to the owner as owner and not as user. Paragraph 8. In assessments under the single tax, all values created by individual use or improvement would be excluded, and the only value taken into consideration would be the value attaching to the bare land by reason of neighborhood, etc., to be determined by impartial periodical assessments. Thus, the farmer would have no more taxes to pay than the speculator who held a similar piece of land idle, and the man who on a city lot erected a valuable building would be taxed no more than the man who held a similar lot vacant. Paragraph 9. The single tax, in short, would call upon men to contribute to the public revenues, not in proportion to what they produce or accumulate, but in proportion to the value of the natural opportunities they hold. It would compel them to pay just as much for holding land idle as for putting it to its fullest use. Paragraph 10. The single tax, therefore, would, Section 1, take the weight of taxation off of the agricultural districts where land has little or no value irrespective of improvements, and put it on towns and cities where bare land rises to a value of millions of dollars per acre. Section 2. Dispense with a multiplicity of taxes and a horde of tax gatherers. Simplify government and greatly reduce its cost. Section 3. Do away with the fraud, corruption, and gross inequality inseparable from our present methods of taxation, which allow the rich to escape while they grind the poor. Land cannot be hid or carried off, and its value can be ascertained with greater ease and certainty than any other. Section 4. Give us with all the world as perfect freedom of trade as now exists between the states of our Union, thus enabling our people to share, through free exchanges, in all the advantages which nature has given to other countries, or which the peculiar skill of other peoples has enabled them to attain. It would destroy the trusts, monopolies, and corruptions which are the outgrowths of the tariff. Section 4 continued. It would do away with the fines and penalties now levied on anyone who improves a farm, erects a house, builds a machine, or in any way adds to the general stock of wealth. It would leave everyone free to apply labor or expend capital in production or exchange without fine or restriction, and would leave to each the full product of his exertion. Section 5. It would, on the other hand, by taking for public use that value which attaches to land by reason of the growth and improvement of the community, make the holding of land unprofitable to the mere owner and profitable only to the user. It would thus make it impossible for speculators and monopolists to hold natural opportunities unused or only half used, and would throw open to labor the illimitable field of employment which the earth offers to man. Section 5 continued. It would thus solve the labor problem, do away with involuntary poverty, raise wages in all occupations to the full earnings of labor, make overproduction impossible until all human wants are satisfied, render labor-saving inventions a blessing to all, and cause such an enormous production and such an equitable distribution of wealth as would give to all comfort, leisure, and participation in the advantages of an advancing civilization. Paragraph 11. With respect to monopolies other than a monopoly on land, we hold that where free competition becomes impossible, as in telegraphs, railroads, water and gas supplies, etc., such business becomes a proper social function, which should be controlled and managed by and for the whole people concerned, through their proper governmental, local, state, or national, as may be. Only this final plank generated opposition. A motion to strike out the clause was defeated, however. Only a few persons out of several hundred in attendance voted against adoption of the platform. On December 5, 1890, Henry George experienced a great pain on the left side of his head. Although his speech was not slurred, he spoke using wrong words. He was diagnosed with aphasia. Within a few days, the symptoms disappeared, and he fully recovered his ability to speak. But it was clear to him and others that his health was fragile. He needed to slow down from the hectic pace of commitments he had taken on. Understanding that what had happened to him was a clear sign that his time might be short, George began writing the book on political economy that later had to be finished by his son before it could be published. The single tax cause then experienced a significant loss when the Standard was forced to cease publication at the end of August 1892. However, George expressed optimism, writing in the final number, "The work that the Standard was intended to do has been done, and in the larger field into which our movement has passed, there is no longer need for it. For the usefulness of a journal devoted to the propagation of an idea must diminish as its end is attained." George's convert, Tom L. Johnson, now serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, kept up pressure on his fellow Democrats to eliminate tariffs. Henry George listened in the gallery as Johnson made their free trade case. By 1892, Henry George and Thomas Sherman concluded that the most likely strategy for success was to argue for an income tax-based land value tax. He made his case before the Committee on Ways and Means on October 16, 1893. Sherman stated, "It is high time that some form of practically direct taxation should be resorted to by the federal government. Every form of indirect taxation is iniquitous, not merely because it is unjust and unequal, but because its injustice and inequality all bear with tremendous severity upon the poor in proportion to their poverty and favor the rich in proportion to their wealth." Under that unfortunate provision of the federal Constitution, which forbids the imposition of what it calls direct taxes, except in proportion to population, it is impossible for Congress to levy a direct tax on accumulated wealth of any kind, in proportion to its value, without apportioning this tax among the states according to their population, instead of according to their wealth. This apportionment would be so manifestly unequal that no substantial support could be obtained for such a proposal. After a thorough analysis of all possible options, Sherman put his solution on the record. We should tax all income which is derived from monopolies, whether natural or artificial. It is not only fair and just that the government should tax every species of monopoly or exclusive franchise, it is a crying shame that such incomes are not now and always taxed. These are in fact the only kinds of property which ought to be taxed, because they are the only valuable things which men do not create by their own industry. The government creates and gives away these franchises. At the Second National Single Tax Convention held in August of 1893 in Chicago, paragraph 11 was altered by the delegates over the objections of Henry George. It is worth noting that delegates were far fewer in number than had attended the 1890 convention in New York. Lewis F. Post describes the significance. The platform change marked one of the radical differences between two factions of the single tax movement. For convenience of reference rather than precision of statement, they might be called the socialistic and the individualistic factions, using each of these terms in its real and not in its vulgar epithetical sense. Therefore, Henry George opposed a drawing in the single tax platform of any definite line between public and private functions. It was in opposition, individualistic opposition to Henry George's views, that this clause was displaced by one which limited public functions to maintaining and controlling public ways for the transportation of persons and property and the transmission of intelligence, and also to furnish water, gas, and all other things that necessarily require the use of such common ways. On August 29th, George delivered an address at the convention in which he pointed to the reasons why the programs of neither anarchists nor socialists would remove injustice from the human condition. The single tax program, on the other hand, steers between the two. It recognizes on the one hand that man is an individual, but it recognizes on the other hand that man is a social animal, born in society and tended to live in society. The need for some type of direct tax on individual income was widely recognized. Legislation was passed in 1894, the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, that included a 2% tax on incomes over $4,000 to counter revenue forecasted to be lost because of tariff reductions. Then Tennessee Representative Benton McMillan proposed adding wages to the income tax bill, causing Henry George to oppose the legislation. In Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, Charles Pollock challenged the income tax provision of the 1894 Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, and in a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the income tax on income from property was a direct tax and thus was unconstitutional because it was not apportioned by state population as required under Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4, which reads, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken." The United States of America was now emerging out of its isolation in pursuit of the nation's manifest destiny. The American victory over Spain in 1898 added Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to U.S. territory. One consequence was that revenue from tariffs no longer sufficed to meet the expenses of the federal government. An editorial in the Johnstown, Pennsylvania Democrat called out to the nation in words Henry George would have approved. Every single taxer understands that imperialism has but one spur, and that is greed. It has gone to grab franchises, to gobble up land, to appropriate valuable natural opportunities, to grasp new privileges, and through these to exploit labor. This new era required new strategies for promoting the single tax, and new leaders emerged following Henry George's death in 1897. When Joseph Fels, one of the family owners of the Fels Naphtha Soap Company, joined the cause, he brought with him both new ideas and the money to put them into action. Henry George Jr. was advanced in the 1897 mayoral election to take the place of his fallen father. He then stepped up to play a leading role in the movement, and in 1910 was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, then re-elected in 1912. The movement had other vigorous leaders as well. Shown here, left to right, are C.B. Philibrown of Massachusetts, Tom L. Johnson of Cleveland, Ohio, George L. Record, and Charles O'Connor Hennessy of New Jersey. Thomas G. Shearman survived Henry George by just a few years, dying on the 29th of September 1900. Proponents of the single tax worked on their own without any effective coordination for the next several years. A national single tax conference was finally held in New York City during November of 1907. Delegates attended from just 10 states and the District of Columbia. The American Single Tax League was formed at this conference, with Bolton Hall, a Princeton University graduate, lawyer, and well-known author, elected president, and the Honorable John J. Murphy as General Secretary. With headquarters in New York City, the League functioned for 2 years before ceasing its activities. A new effort at organization occurred in 1909 with the founding of the Joseph Fels Fund of America and a commission for its administration. Fels endowed the fund with $25,000 per annum for 5 years. The commission's members included prominent figures such as Lincoln Steffens, Frederick C. Howell, Carrie Chapman Catt, Jackson H. Ralston, Daniel Kiefer, Charles H. Ingersoll, George A. Briggs, and A.B. DuPont. At the 1912 annual conference of the Fels Commission, the 1890 version of paragraph 11 of the Single Tax Conference's platform was restored. This was reported on by Lewis F. Post in the Public. The conference further recommends that the basis and principle and general policy of all such Georgist organizations be the platform of the National Single Tax Conference in New York in 1890, which was drafted by Henry George and unanimously recommended by the Committee on Platform. Unfortunately, Fels died shortly after the 4th Annual Joseph Fels Fund and the Single Tax Conference held in Washington, D.C. during January of 1914. Conferences followed in 1915 and 1916 under the auspices of the Joseph Fels Fund International Commission. Other gatherings were organized by the Women's National Single Tax League. In 1917 was formed the National Single Tax League, headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. The conference at Niagara Falls in 1916 was disrupted as an attempt by a faction to gain movement support for establishment of an independent political party occurred. Afterward, Mary Fels decided to end any further subsidies to the existing organization. Mary dissolved the Fund Commission, created a new Joseph Fels International Commission to promote the single tax, headquartered in New York City. The movement gained a seat at the table in 1913 when Lewis F. Post was appointed by Woodrow Wilson as Assistant Secretary of Labor. Post stepped down as editor of the Public. On the 28th of January 1915, he gave an address on taxation at the Cleveland Ben Franklin Club, stating, "There is a general property tax, which is planned to snatch whatever can be got wherever it can be found. Then there are special property taxes, which snatch at what the general property tax has not succeeded in snatching. Then come poll taxes, which tax a man for being alive, and occupation taxes, which tax him if he tries to keep alive by his own useful work. Of the same ilk are business and income taxes. These reach out for a different class. But like the others, they make no distinction between profits and incomes that are earned and profits and incomes that are not earned. As a member of Wilson's administration, Post wrote in December of 1916 approvingly of the president's record. The nation now had a direct tax on income thanks to passage of a constitutional amendment. Of the new income tax, Post wrote, "To be sure, the income tax is not an ideal system of taxation, but it is nearer to the ideal than any kind of federal taxation now constitutional, and in large measure it falls upon the incomes of the privileged. The present tendency is to make it fall there in still greater degree. What direction this tendency would take if the invisible government were to defeat Wilson at the coming election would not be hard to guess." At the end of 1922, Post thought he saw a resurgence in the movement on the horizon. In a letter he wrote to James R. Brown, president of the Manhattan Single Tax Club, Post succinctly went over the movement's history, then looked ahead. Since the World War, our movement appears to have set out upon a vigorous revival of the fiscal policy of the Crosdale period. Inspired by the principles and guided by the program proposed by the Single Tax Conference of 1890, which were formulated by George, Sherman, Johnson, and Crosdale, it seems now to be winning in public sentiment a place more extensive and secure than any it has hitherto held. The policy recommended by that platform was a progressive step-at-a-time policy. Its second clause demanded increase of present taxes on land values until all public revenues are drawn from that source. Its first clause called for abolition, one after another, of all existing taxes other than taxes on land values. Increasingly, what Post wrote for publication in various movement organs were remembrances, as even the second generation of single taxers passed on. His own end came on the 10th of January 1928. During the 1920s, the industrialist John C. Lincoln emerged as the driving force for political organization. The Single Tax Party's name was changed in 1924 to the Commonwealth Land Party, and its first national convention was held in New York City on February 9th. The party's platform, approved in 1920, was affirmed. This included the following: "We therefore demand that the full rent of land be collected by the government in place of all direct and indirect taxes, and that all buildings, machinery, implements, and improvements on land, all industry, thrift, and enterprise, all wages, salaries, incomes, and every product of labor or intellect be entirely exempt from taxation." Also, a resolution specific to the income tax was adopted. Resolved, that the income tax is founded on the communistic principle of equalizing wealth by taxation. It is false in principle and iniquitous in practice, and the income tax law should be repealed. In lieu thereof, the rent of land should be collected by the government and used for public expenses and public improvements. The Commonwealth Land Party's national life proved to be short-lived. Candidates ran for national office in 1924 and 1928, after which the party survived for another year in Pennsylvania and New York. In 1931, John C. Lincoln moved to Arizona. In 1962, Raymond Moley, who had been a member of Roosevelt's Brain Trust, documented Lincoln's life. Of his advocacy of the single tax, Moley wrote, "The Commonwealth Land Party in 1924 nominated John C. Lincoln as its candidate for vice president on a ticket headed by William J. Wallace of New Jersey. The only purpose of that party was the promulgation of the Georgist philosophy, and Lincoln later doubted its effectiveness. Years later, he said, 'It was a crazy thing to do.'" The movement was now increasingly being referred to as Georgist after its founder. Principles of political economy taught after 1932 at the Henry George Schools of Social Science as Georgism. Activism was directed toward state legislatures for enabling legislation and toward local governments for adoption of what was described as the graded tax system or as land value taxation. At the same time, in the United States, there were those such as Ralph Borsodi who were sympathetic to and active in the Georgist cause, but gradually came to challenge the very way people were coming to live in large metropolises characterized by a polluted environment, corrupt political machines, and for many, the lack of access to a decent quality of life. As a young man, Borsodi was active in the Single Tax Party and served as editor of the Single Taxer. His first major writing, This Ugly Civilization, was published in 1928. This was followed in 1933 by Flight from the City. Mildred J. Loomis, Borsodi's longtime collaborator, describes the practical impact resulting from publication of This Ugly Civilization. The book led to an invitation from Dayton, Ohio, for Borsodi to assist the social agencies in dealing with overwhelming unemployment. Borsodi helped them to get people out of the city, to build their own houses, produce their own food, attain a new measure of independence and security on small plots of land. Then in 1936, Borsodi and others founded the School of Living on 4 acres of land surrounded by 16 2-acre family homesteads in Suffern, Rockland County, New York. A cooperative corporation purchased and held title to the 40 acres. Each homesteading family was charged a small annual rental and had 1 vote in the cooperative's governance. The cooperative survived until 1945, forced by financial pressures to sell the School of Living's building to a private homesteader. As the Second World War was coming to an end, Borsodi feared that the nation's economy would not adjust well to peacetime. In a book titled Inflation is Coming, he explained the problems as he saw them and offered a plan to mitigate them. He did his best to educate readers about the dilemma facing the nation. We can raise taxes each year. We have been raising them. But no matter how high we raise them, we shall never be able to raise them high enough to catch up with this debt unless we balance the national budget. And there is equally little prospect that the procession of deficits will end after the war is over. I base this largely upon the fact that not only the administration, but the people as a whole have come to accept the economic theories of Alvin Hansen and John Maynard Keynes. Nobody now seems to attach much importance to whether the government pays its way or falls behind. Borsodi warned of an inflation-led global economic collapse. This did not happen. Stalin contributed by preventing demobilization and by causing support for the Marshall Plan to start the rebuilding of European and Japanese infrastructure. The creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other financial agreements that came out of the Bretton Woods Conference pushed the problem of inflation into the future. In 1977, as OPEC-driven stagflation turned the post-war economic system on its head, Borsodi argued that the solution was to turn banks into not-for-profit service organizations. Also needed was a transformation of economics into a normative science that takes account of both imputed non-monetary income and monetary income, distinguishes between wealth and filth, between goods and detriments, between providing necessary goods and producing unnecessary evils, becomes the science of how to satisfy wants family by family and household by household, and ceases to being the science of money making. One of the important practical applications of Borsodi's idealism was the creation of a local currency system for the people of Exeter, New Hampshire. Borsodi was not finished. His final work, Inflation and the Coming Keynesian Catastrophe, was finished prior to his death in 1977, but not published until 1989. Our socio-political arrangements and institutions have gone through almost continuous evolutionary change, punctuated from time to time by shock therapy. The Federal Income Tax Code has undergone periodic revision, sometimes in recognition of the accuracy of criticisms raised about its efficiency and equity, at other times in response to pressure from those who possess sufficient influence over elected officials to see changes beneficial to their interests adopted. This has happened with money creation and banking regulations, as thousands of banks have failed and now many that remain are deemed too big to fail. As the above story reveals, there have always been voices crying out from the wilderness, occasionally heard, and their calls for systemic change acted upon. What about the key focus of activists within the Henry George community? Efforts to get local governments to tax land values heavier and property improvement values lighter. Across the United States, there are thousands of towns, cities, boroughs, townships, school districts, and counties that today raise revenue by the taxation of both land and improvement values. Despite continuous efforts to promote the public capture of economic rent via taxation, very few states have passed enabling legislation. Even where there is such legislation in existence, such as in Pennsylvania, only a tiny portion of the total taxing jurisdictions have opted to adopt the Georgist reform. Nor is there any groundswell in this desired direction, at least not yet. After closely studying the above history, Rick DeMare began in 2019 making the case to the Henry George community for, quote, a modern Georgist democratic platform that he believes addresses both the land and money questions. Building on the 1890 platform, he recommends the following. My comments are added. First, universal single-payer health care, where the U.S. Congress is the single payer, but funded by paper and electronic U.S. notes, not Federal Reserve notes. Well, I am among those who believe that any society that deserves to be called a society should do all that is possible to ensure every member has access to the highest quality of health care. I also embrace transferring authority for money issuance to the U.S. Treasury and eliminating the need by government to issue bonds purchased with fiat currency issued by the commercial bank-owned Federal Reserve System. Ideally, the revenue for payment of healthcare expenses would eventually be provided by the public capture of economic rents. Second, forgiveness of private debts and conversion of the national debt into the national wealth by replacing most Federal Reserve notes with U.S. notes. Basing this conversion on Congress's bankruptcy powers and on the unconstitutionality of making the 1934 series to date Federal Reserve note legal tender. My feeling is that the notion that all private debts should be forgiven assumes that credit extended by some to others to enable the purchase of needed or desired goods and services is unjust. Well, those that either allow payment over time or extend a loan to enable a purchase be made without credit from a seller are entitled to compensation for A, the time value of the money advanced, and B, the risk of default by the borrower. The process by which outstanding Federal Reserve notes ought to be removed from circulation and destroyed requires a more detailed discussion. Third, any remaining Federal Reserve notes which may be needed by the banking system to lend out deposits must always be redeemable for Congress's lawful money, that is, legal tender U.S. notes and coins, and must not be legal tender in the payment of debts and taxes, but only voluntarily receivable in the payment of debts and taxes. In short, only U.S. notes and coins are to be legal tender. As of today, the trillions of dollars in the possession of individuals, either as Federal Reserve notes, as coins, or as digital asset or liability balances on the globe's network of computers, would require retirement at par with the new U.S. notes. The U.S. government would need to begin making all payments with the U.S. notes or their digital equivalent. While the physical notes would differ in appearance from a Federal Reserve note, The digital form of new U.S. notes would require some means of distinguishing the balances, such as a symbol different from the simple dollar sign, including the letters U.S. in front of a dollar sign. Fourth, all taxes needed to regulate the monetary system are to fall on unearned income and large estates, not on wages, with the understanding that a corporation's net income/profits, along with the dividends paid out from those profits, are also unearned income. Well, Henry George would surely challenge any assertion that a corporation's or any business entity's net income is entirely unearned. Some portion of the revenue generated is a legitimate return to any labor expended by the owners, managing owners as distinguished from disinterested shareholders, and the capital goods employed in whatever goods are produced or services rendered. The challenge is determining what portion of revenue generated is derived from rent-seeking privileges enjoyed under law. Fifth, elimination of all tariffs, including those levied against the United States, but with heavy taxes falling on net corporate profits and dividends derived from the hiring of cheap labor, no matter where on earth that cheap labor is found. Such tax receipts are to be proportionately shared among the 4 levels of government: local, state, or county, national, and international. The rationale being that when unearned income is sufficiently shared and properly recognized as including corporate profits and dividends, with local foreign governments, protectionist tariff policies against the United States become unnecessary. My view here is that the money wages received by any person employed by others is determined by a number of factors. Where monopoly privilege exists, wages for many tend towards subsistence. Where laws regarding working conditions, environmental protections, and other social welfare measures are weak or non-existent, the government of the United States has no authority to intervene unless by treaty, trade agreement, or international law to which both nations are signatories. What the U.S. government could do is mandate that no U.S. company is permitted to employ citizens of other countries without adhering to the same standards, subject to appropriate cost of living adjustments as those enjoyed by employees based in the United States. Sixth, government takeover, that is, government management of all utilities, transportation and communication networks, energy companies, mining operations, and other natural opportunities, with the understanding that a natural opportunity is determined by the use of scientific criteria to assure the government does not unnecessarily impose itself on legitimate free market industries, but only on industries where free market competition is not possible. One challenge here is whether government is able to compete with private business for the management and technically skilled workers required to keep up with the fast-moving changes in state-of-the-art performance in critical areas of our integrated economy. A good start in the determination of the right balance between private and public sector ownership and management would be to streamline regulatory processes and vigorously enforce antitrust legislation. And so Rick has given us some important things to think about. For those of us who have taught to others a system of political economy developed by Henry George, we certainly support the elimination of all taxation, with public revenue generated by the public capture of economic rents of land, other natural assets, and any other asset having an inelastic supply. That is what we lecture about, write about, and agitate for. Getting anywhere near this outcome is hard to foresee. There is no light at the end of our public policy tunnel. As with single taxers, Georgists, and land value taxers over the last century and a half, those of us involved today come to Henry George with differing degrees of confidence in and support for public sector involvement in economic affairs or even the social welfare of our fellow citizens. We continue to debate the certain path to the just society, to equality of opportunity, and to the protection of individual liberty. We wonder what it will take for our fellow humans to one day realize that we possess and want to share a fundamental truth. As has Rick DeMare, so have others, myself included, spent some time coming to an understanding of how the systems of money creation, banking, and credit issuance work within the parallel system of property rights that secure and protect the private appropriation of a large portion of a society's aggregate economic rents. How important, we ask, is Ellen Brown's campaign to establish public banks in every state and even cities across the United States? What would our society look like by establishing financial institutions charged not with profit maximization for disinterested shareholders, but with a responsibility to nurture local commerce, provide funding for physical and cultural infrastructure, and the strengthening of community institutions? From Josh Sidman, head of the Sylvia Gazelle Foundation, we have been introduced to the concept of demurrage, stamping currency to the effect that it loses some portion of its nominal exchange value if held rather than spent into the economy. Gazelle argued this would discourage hoarding of currency and accelerate its velocity, moving from person to person. An important side effect is to pull the rate of interest on borrowed money towards zero. Josh sees Gazelle's proposal as systemically important and a game changer. Back in 1996, Stephen Zarlenga decided to investigate money creation and offer his own solutions to monetary inflation and the problems this causes. The American Monetary Institute was born. Zarlenga argued in The Lost Science of Money that the solutions were already known, but were subverted and ignored. AMI drafted needed legislation in 2004, refined since a number of times. What would the AMI proposal accomplish? It draws from and improves a previous proposal known as the Chicago Plan, which was advanced by Professors Henry Simons, Irving Fisher, and other leading economists in the 1930s in response to the wreckage of the Great Depression, which resulted from our poorly conceived banking system. By 1933, Henry Simons had worked out the main elements of his thinking on money in an unpublished tract titled Banking and Currency Reform, which explained the rationale for a 100% reserve plan and argued for policies that would lead to price stability. Simons was an equal opportunity critic of government policies and actions. In 1934, he wrote, "One cannot criticize the policies of the present administration without seeming to approve those of its predecessors. In fact, one must condemn the Democrats mainly for their wholesale extension of the worst policies of the past. The gold policy and the silver legislation, like the Federal Reserve System, lead from a bad monetary and banking system only into something worse." Simons argued that sound monetary policy must be based on some kind of rule and principle. The proper role of government was to do whatever was necessary to maintain a tolerably stable level of prices. Thus, the federal government had to assume primary responsibility for the money supply, taking this power away from the commercial banks. One additional observation from Simons before moving on. I've never seen any sense in an elaborate structure of federal debt. The national government must, of course, provide and regulate the currency, a task it has never faced. In wartime and in peacetime, we should issue currency and/or bonds. We should never disguise currency as bonds or conversely. Another unique set of perspectives on the money question has been around since the 1970s from the pen of Warren Mosler and the ideas of A. Mitchell Innes and Abba Lerner. We now regularly read about modern monetary theory as proposals for systemic reform gain wider and wider analysis, critique, support, and refinement. Mosler received his practical education working in the financial sector at a time of intense stress on the global economy. As he recalls, "I saw the great inflation as cost-push phenomena driven by OPEC's pricing power. It had every appearance of a cartel setting ever higher prices, which caused the great inflation, and a simple supply response that broke it. The outcome was for a general inflation to ensue, so while OPEC did get higher prices for its oil, they also had to pay higher prices for what they wanted to buy, leaving real terms of trade not all that different after the price of oil finally settled between $10 and $5 per barrel, where it remained for over a decade. In 2010, his book, 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, challenged the accepted wisdom of the economics discipline, which is listed as: the government must raise funds through taxation or borrowing in order to spend. In other words, government spending is limited by its ability to tax or borrow. With government deficits, we are leaving our debt burden to our children. Government budget deficits take away savings. Social Security is broken. The trade deficit is an unsustainable imbalance that takes away jobs and output. We need savings to provide the funds for investment. And finally, it's a bad thing that higher deficits today mean higher taxes tomorrow. The book by Mosler has nothing to say about the private appropriation of economic rents and the impact this has on the shortfall in public revenue. He views taxation not primarily as a means of raising needed revenue, but as a means of achieving desired public policy outcomes. Mosler has been joined in his effort to rationalize the roles of money creation, public debt, and taxation by economics professors Stephanie Keldon and L. Randall Way. When asked about the skyrocketing public debt, Professor Keldon answered this way: the deficit hawks try to convince us that at some point the debt has to be paid back, and that the bill is going to fall on the rest of us. That's not the case at all. Calling this thing the national debt is a big problem. What's really happening is that the government is basically making some of its payments with interest-bearing dollars. We call those dollars U.S. Treasuries. Unfortunately, we call the entire stockpile of these financial instruments the national debt. She continues, if I had to describe the modern monetary theory project in a single sentence, I would say it is about replacing an artificial revenue constraint with a real inflation constraint. So there are limits. But the limit is not a predetermined numerical level or a percentage of the budget. A currency issuing government can afford to buy whatever is priced and available for sale in its own currency. The limit is the impact of the spending, not the spending itself and not the deficit. The limit is inflation. That is central to MMT. I would be remiss if I did not give at least a moment's attention to the influence of John Maynard Keynes in these matters. Keynes put down his thoughts in 1929 in a tract on monetary reform. Keynes sought a path toward stability in the world where instability was the norm. The proper course for a central bank, he concluded, is to watch and to control the creation of credit and to let the creation of currency follow suit, rather than as formerly to watch and to control the creation of currency and to let the creation of credit follow suit. Keynes went on to credit Irving Fisher as, quote, the pioneer of price stability as against exchange stability, but challenged Fisher's method for achieving this desired outcome. Keynes favored establishing a standard composite commodity index to determine the need for credit expansion or contraction. Importantly, he anticipated modern monetary theorists, arguing that, quote, anything we can actually do, we can afford. Keynes recognized that there is a paradox of thrift when individual behavior spending and saving behavior is thought through. While individual saving is sensible financial strategy, if everyone in a society collectively saves more and more, this will result in a decrease in aggregate demand, a reduction in output, employment, and income. In the end, the result is a reduction in aggregate savings. When this occurs, the public sector must step in to prevent a serious economic contraction. And of course, that raises all of the issues about the means by which this should occur. Michael Hudson is regularly interviewed by podcasters and has a strong following. He has a good appreciation for the Georgist perspectives, speaks in favor of the public capture of economic rents, and is highly critical of neoclassical economics, as conveyed in his 2017 book here. Key arguments made by Michael include: economic theories typically work backward from a set of desired conclusions to models that will result in those conclusions. Mainstream economic theory starts with the conclusion that the free market is self-stabilizing and leads to optimum outcomes. The economic measures chosen by an economic theory are part of the design of that theory. Mainstream economics uses coarse-grained measures such as GDP and ignore, or rather deride, measures of distribution of income and wealth. Furthermore, mainstream economic metrics, as well as mainstream economic theory, do not make a distinction between productive economic activity and parasitic economic rent in the form of land and housing rents, monopoly pricing based on patent rights, privatized provision of basic services such as water and electricity, and monopoly pricing of healthcare. All such forms of income are treated as earned income. Mainstream economic theories and metrics ignore asset prices as a form of wealth formation, this despite the fact that asset price increases are the primary source of wealth in modern economics. One of these days I will try to get Michael to explain why he concludes that revenue generated by the leasing of a housing unit to someone is parasitic economic rent and not a legitimate form of income to the owner who for some stated period of time transfers use of the asset to a tenant. Moreover, an owner-occupant of a residential property is both benefiting by imputed economic rent from the land held, but also incurring ongoing expenses for maintenance of the housing unit, which is a depreciating asset. And finally, for Michael, asset price increases in real estate are a significant driver of the ever-increasing share of interest payments on debt, payments that go almost exclusively to the 1%. Asset price increases are generally exogenous to the productive economy and in fact act as a brake on growth of the productive economy. We cannot forget Steve Keen, the author of the 2021 book, The New Economics, a Manifesto. Is there any other member of the economics discipline not a full-blown Marxist who is as critical of neoclassical economic theory and its adherents? He writes, I regard neoclassical economics as not merely a bad methodology for economic analysis, but as an existential threat to the continued existence of capitalism and human civilization in general. It has to go. Professor Keen has raised the intellectual stakes as he has gained a huge following. He uses statistics and trend analysis to confirm that changes in the supply and price of money, credit, and debt have important impacts on a nation's macroeconomic performance. Moreover, he demonstrates that disrupted markets do not by themselves return to a state of general equilibrium. And from there, he is just getting started. As Professor Keen analyzes the U.S. residential property markets, however, he repeats the mistake of almost all other economists when he tells us that, quote, U.S. house prices are more than 2.5 times higher in real terms than they were in the 1970s. Well, the value of a housing unit is, with the exception of housing units that have historic significance as a collectible, its replacement cost less depreciation. We in the Henry George community can show him with statistics that almost the entire increase he refers to is the result of skyrocketing land prices. And what is the cause of skyrocketing land prices? It is the market capitalization of privately captured economic rents. It is important to point out that this chart above tells us that 1/2 of all building lots sold for more than the median price in every year. Keen points to a different cause. The main factor making housing unaffordable in the USA and most of the rest of the world is too much mortgage lending by banks. This is not just a US phenomenon, it is common to every country that has deregulated its financial sector. This assertion by Professor Keene requires serious discussion. What then is someone guided by the study of Henry George's political economy to make of all this? Does George actually help us reach scientifically derived conclusions, or was George right for his time but could not have anticipated the innovations, both constructive and destructive, that have occurred during the 20th and 21st centuries? Life is filled with all sorts of unanticipated experiences. As a young person, I aspired to be an artist. Instead, I ended up with a degree in accounting that led to a career in financial services, for some years managing the residential mortgage loan program for a commercial bank, and finally 20 years in various management and analyst roles in the Northeast Regional Office of Fannie Mae. Early on, I discovered the existence of the Philadelphia extension of the Henry George School of Social Science, completed its program, joined the faculty, and a few years later began working on a Master of Liberal Arts degree at Temple University. All in all, a totally unanticipated journey that continues. Over the years, I have written frequently about both the land and money questions, reaching conclusions of what systemic reforms seem both potentially effective and achievable. Not long after earning my undergraduate degree, I was bold enough to write a letter to the then governor of Pennsylvania, Milton Schaap, regarding the land boom affecting the U.S. economy. I included the following quote from an article appearing in the July 1973 issue of Fortune magazine. Fortune said, "This special advantage enjoyed by landowners is right in keeping with the tendency to all 20th century tax systems to shoot anything that moves and to spare anything that stands still. Income taxes, corporation profit taxes, sales taxes, capital gains taxes, even estate taxes all penalize motion. The value added tax, to which Europe is becoming addicted, uses an automatic to shoot at every leap of the economic dough." Surprisingly, I received two responses. One from Edward Simon, director of the Office of State Planning and Development, and a second response from Eugene R. Eisman, urban advisor to the governor, who wrote this: "I thought that you might want to see the enclosed article written by Mr. A.L. Heidemann Jr., the Department of Community Affairs Executive Deputy Secretary. This article explores the proposal developed by Henry George concerning the possibility of a land value tax. The Department of Community Affairs has been advocating the George method as one possible alternative to the property tax." Strangely enough, I had heard Al Heidemann speak about Henry George and land value taxation at a public forum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania during the summer of 1972. I approached him, asked for more information, and shortly thereafter received a stack of articles from him about land value taxation. Years passed until 1980, when I learned there was an extension of the Henry George School of Social Science in Philadelphia. From the beginning of my intensifying involvement in the Henry George community, my attention was drawn to the financial arena. In March 1983, I presented a paper titled "The International Finance Dilemma" at the conference of the Council of Georgist Organizations. The people of the world were trying to adapt to the rising cost of fossil fuels triggered by the creation of OPEC and the stagflation that challenged conventional economics to explain simultaneous high inflation and high employment. I noted the following: nations as well as businesses everywhere forced into the money markets to secure badly needed cash triggered a tremendous rise in interest rates, which in 1980 resulted in the largest number of loan defaults and business bankruptcies since the 1930s. The U.S. government was now set on a path of continued increases in budget deficits, escalating public debt, and a higher and higher cost to service the debt. I offered an opinion of the longer-term consequences. Will there ever come a day of reckoning? Some economists say yes, Arthur Laffer, for instance, and others say no. Deficits in government borrowing are not very important. You begin to realize the significance of government deficits worldwide and the consequence of borrowing to pay current rather than capital expenditures upon examination of the concentration of credit and debt. Fewer than a dozen major international financial conglomerates, Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Barclays, as well as Swiss and German banks, hold as assets the vast majority of all the borrowing by government and the private sector. In 1985, I began coursework at Temple University toward a Master of Liberal Arts degree. For the next 5 years, my formal studies kept me busy with research and writing. For one project, I examined the Saudi Arabian economy to determine what, from the Saudi perspective, was the optimum price of a barrel of oil. The results were quite interesting. What this analysis also suggests is that Saudi economic development is now broadly established. Because of this, drastic cuts in the government's domestic programs were not required to ensure long-term expansion. Lower crude oil prices, gradually obtained as a result of adjustment in supply to demand, were offset by higher oil production and market share. At the same time, the lower energy costs stimulated worldwide economic activity and stabilized the return on foreign capital investments realized by the Saudis. What my research has shown is that Saudi Arabia is far better positioned to weather the storm than many other nations, particularly those that have not had the benefit of sitting on an ocean of oil. Back in the mid-1980s, there was a program on public television called Adam Smith's Money World. Late that year, one of the guests was David Maxwell, the CEO of the Federal National Mortgage Association, better known as Fannie Mae. I wrote to the program's host, Jerry Goodman, with comments and recommending he do a future program on the advantages of land value taxation. Shortly thereafter, I received a letter from David Maxwell, who stated, Jerry Goodman, Adam Smith was good enough to send me a copy of your letter to him of November 12. You may be surprised to learn that I thoroughly agree with you about the taxation of raw land. In fact, I wrote my third-year paper at Harvard Law School on Henry George, using the experience of Arden, Delaware as a case study of a place which had put his theories into practice. Not long after, my employer, Provident National Bank, merged with PNC Financial Corp. I was informed that PNC's subsidiary, based in Ohio, would be taking over the bank's residential mortgage loan business. I was now in the job market. With David Maxwell's comments in my mind, I contacted Fannie Mae, was invited in for an interview, and a week or so later was offered a position as supervisor of a group of review underwriters who audited the quality of the mortgage loans Fannie Mae was purchasing. Yet another unanticipated development in the life's journey. As I am reading through the material I have compiled on my activism over the last 45 years, memories long forgotten come back. I was writing letters to the editor or to prominent individuals, hoping this would do something more than adding another brick to the wall. In 1985, really just beginning my work toward my MLA degree, I somehow was sufficiently brazen to seek support from one of my professors for a course I offered to teach on political economy. My files do not include a response. However, my relationship with this particular professor remained strong throughout my studies and came back later when I was teaching in the university's senior adult education program, when this particular professor signed up for the course I was teaching. I did not give up on this idea of bringing a remedial course on political economy to university undergraduates. In April of 1986, I wrote a long letter to another of my professors, Dr. Sandra Featherman, informing her that I was in the early stage of writing a book to provide evidence in support of Henry George's analysis. I asked her if she would be willing to review the manuscript when finished. My records do not contain any written response from her, but in 1989, she was a presenter at the conference of the International Union for Land Value Taxation and Free Trade held on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania. I continued to write to my professors, offering them constructive comments on how the courses they were teaching might be made even better. One monetary theorist I have not referred to above is Thomas Greco Jr., who I first met at a Council of Georgist Organizations conference in Atlanta, Georgia in 1988. After reading his paper on money and debt, I wrote to him with comments regarding his arguments for the replacement of government-issued legal tender with a composite standard currency. At that point in my thinking, I supported the idea of backing currency with a composite of precious metals. I suggested a decentralized system of international banks of deposit chartered to perform functions very similar to those of the original Bank of Amsterdam, but taking advantage of the age of electronic transfers. My letter to Tom included more specific details should anyone have an interest in my thinking at the time. One would think that my final project for my MLA degree would have been to take on some aspect of Henry George's work and expand on that. Instead, I chose as my topic challenges to the global monetary structure. My introduction explained what I believe the evidence presented would substantiate. The scope of this paper neither permits nor demands an historical overview of the use of various commodities and eventual adoption of silver and gold as the preferred mediums of exchange and storehouses of value. Rather, I offer evidence on behalf of the thesis that those in power have consistently exploited the governed, including when possible the citizens of other societies, by manipulation and control of a monetary system created to advance centralized power and to sanction what amounts to a pervasive pattern of theft of wealth from producers. The essential ingredient has been the power of the state and of banks to self-create credit. The consequences of this assumed power have been the confiscation of wealth from producers not only by direct taxation, but also by the issuance of legal tender, which, unlike certificates of deposit for coinage or bullion, give to the bearer no specific claim to wealth of a given quantity and quality. Rather, legal tender acquires exchange value because of the coercive imposition of the power of the state. As I was introduced to the writings of those included above and many others, my views continued to change as the insights of others challenged my positions with common sense, logic, and facts. I continue to write on the issue somewhat regularly for Land and Liberty, the Georgist Journal, Progress, Groundswell, Equal Rights, papers delivered at CGO or IU gatherings, and many papers that remain unpublished except in the archives of the School of Cooperative Individualism website. World Watch magazine was particularly good over the years in printing my letters to the editor. If one could be judged successful in purpose by volume of output, my output would rank me as highly influential. Perhaps our great collective achievement is that the remnant is now growing and may one day soon blossom again into a movement to be reckoned with. And with that, let the discussion begin.